All right, Herle Burly-ites. Keith Boag is returning for his fourth appearance on the Herle Burly because I never get tired of talking with Keith. He's one of the great Canadian journalists of his generation. After being the chief political correspondent for CBC TV in Ottawa, he spent a number of years stationed in Los Angeles and Washington. He's become one of the keenest and most insightful analysts of American politics I know. Keith's going to be an air quotes correspondent for the remainder of the U.S. election, writing regularly for our prose publication Quotes. We're going to set the stage today. So much has happened in the last month in America. The candidates have changed, the narratives are now different, the momentum has shifted, all in the Democrats' favor. But the issue set remains the same, and in my view, it favors Trump. Let's get into it, Herle Burly-ites. What's really going on in the race for the White House? Good morning, Keith. How are you?
So far, so good. How are you, David?
I'm great. Am I keeping you from golf today?
Not today.
Not today?
No.
I haven't played.
I have a lunch appointment that interferes with golf, and it's not yet lunchtime, so we're all good.
We're all good. Have you made your peace with that game yet, or does it still drive you to the levels of distraction it used to?
You know, I think I'm making peace with that game. I've lowered my expectations for my performance, which has allowed me to raise my expectations for my enjoyment. And I think that's a better balance for someone who's been at it as long as I have with the results that I've achieved.
That's the only place I had to get to, which is don't expect yourself to be any good at all. Like, why would you? And then you can actually enjoy it. But up until then, my God, it's
I could talk at length about this, so be careful.
So, hey, when is it that you got so intensely interested in American politics? When you became a correspondent in the U.S. or before? You've been a student of this all your life? Before? Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, you know, I remember the Kennedy assassination, and that made me aware of U.S. politics in an extraordinary way that nothing has ever matched. I remember thinking at the time, I will never, ever get used to the idea of the word president in front of Johnson. And then I had a conscious recollection of how little time that took. And my interest in U.S. politics waxed and waned through the years. But it's been such an ever-present part of our own political discussion, and these things interest me all through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And then I guess I became more deeply interested in it when I got into the Robert Caro, Lyndon Johnson biographies, which took me to a depth of understanding in U.S. politics that I had never been before. And I know you're familiar with that, and I hope a lot of the people listening to this podcast are. Can I say President Johnson now?
Yes.
I didn't even know that you were wearing that. For those who can't see it, there's a T-shirt that says "All the Way with LBJ," worn by our host David Herle.
Yeah,
good for you.
My favorite U.S. politician.
Really?
Yeah. So, what is it now that is so? I mean, it's a silly question about what is so compelling about it, because it's the biggest thing going on politically in the world, as near as I can tell. So it's obviously compelling. But I've seen other journalists from Canada go down to the States, and it seems like it's a difficult thing to get back interested in Canadian politics once you've been immersed in American politics, right?
Yes.
You start to get less interested in what the scam is around the ArriveCan app. Right? When the big questions of the world are at stake.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, the circumstances of our politics right now don't lead us to the kind of imagination about a catastrophic future that the U.S. Circumstances do. You say it's the most important story in the world, political story in the world? Yeah, it is, because every other thing you think is important in the world is heavily dependent on what happens in the United States at the top of their government structure, whether that be climate change or the security of Europe or what's happening in the Middle East or trade. All of it does. And most particularly now, we've considered the U.S. to be the leader of the free world for a long, long time, meaning that it is where the very heart of democracy resides. And sometimes, that works well there, and sometimes it doesn't work as well. But no one has come along to replace it as an idea until now. And that is really what is at stake here, and why we need to take this really, really seriously, and why we're invested in the consequences of the US election. And it has enormous repercussions for journalism and how we cover it, because this is not a thing that you can bring the kind of objectivity to that we normally bring to a news story. We, as journalists and as a society, have a stake in the outcome of this election. And that stake is freedom and democracy and the rule of law.
When I was in university, I studied a book called American Politics, The Promise of Disharmony by Samuel Huntington. I've referred to this book before in the pod because it made a big impact on me. Because the thesis of the book was that every revolution in America, every upheaval in America throughout history, unlike revolutions in other parts of the world, has not been a rejection of the American model, but a demand for fuller application of the American model. It has been people, whether it is the Black community or whether it's women or various things, appealing for their piece of the American dream. They weren't rejecting the American dream, they just felt it should apply to them as well. Mm-hmm. And now we appear to be in a situation where there's actually a movement in the United States that rejects the ideals of the United States. Mm-hmm. How did that come about?
Well, that's a huge question. But, one of the things that you made me think of as you were telling that story that I wanted to say before, when people draw false equivalence between the sometimes violent Black Lives Matter movement and the violence associated with the attempt to overthrow the results of the last election, the reason that equivalence is false, because on the one side, you have people following the ideal that you represented. They're trying to make it work, right? And they're frustrated, and they sometimes turn to violence, but they're trying to make it work. And on the other side, you have people who are trying to make it not work. And to find an equivalence between those two things is absurd.
Right.
How did we get here? There are many people. I think I would rather say we've known for a while from the minds of intelligent, thoughtful people that the United States, in choosing the path that it did in the 18th century, meaning democracy, the system of government and accountability and checks and balances, knew at the same time that they were building a system that could be vulnerable to a demagogue, that a demagogue could use those principles of democracy, exploit them, take advantages of the vulnerabilities in them, and succeed. I think that's where we are now. There are a lot of reasons why we came to that point, but I think that is probably the essential core of the answer to the question. This was always possible. It relied on the characters of the moment to ensure that it did not happen. Donald Trump is not such a character.
Hence the importance of George Washington leaving the job.
Absolutely. There's a feeling of, it's kind of taken for granted how this all evolved. But what a momentous decision that was, given the context of the time and the absolute absence of a real-time example for him to follow. His only choice was to set an example, and that was the one he chose. And in ways, Franklin Delano Roosevelt aside, Washington's example has endured, but I don't think that it has been tested in the way that it's about to be tested.
Right. Okay, let's get into the sheer politics of this. With Biden gone and Harris doing well, the Democrats are almost giddy with excitement. Trump seems to have withdrawn from campaigning, and Vance is drawing flies as he goes around the country. But whether it's TV series or political campaigns, Keith, when something seems this inevitable, there's often a shift in the story arc. Who would you bet your money on right now, and how much?
I really like the metaphor that you're using there. I think it's really apt and appropriate. I think we are in kind of we're in a narrative right now at the point of increasing action towards a climate. And because that happens in a political context doesn't mean that our responses to it weren't conditioned a long time ago in movie theaters across the country, across the nation, right? I think a lot of what we are seeing, even in the hustings with Kamala Harris and her new running mate, is a typical response to a dramatic performance. We're just completely absorbed by the story as though it had been written by Steven Spielberg. Yeah. So the expectation is that the ending will be a happy one. There is not enough reason to believe that is true, but there is certainly more reason to believe it might be true than there was 3 weeks ago. But as you said earlier, the issue set still favors Donald Trump.
Right.
And I think our experience of the last two elections is enough fair warning that no matter how it looks and how exciting it feels and how much more confidence there is on the side of Democrats, it's going to be a close election. And by close, we mean close in the way of 2016 and 2020, which means an election decided by thousands of votes in a handful of states, not tens of thousands of votes, but thousands of votes that may add up to a few tens of thousands. But thousands of votes in a handful of states is not very much at all. That's what it's going to end up like, I think.
Right. Yeah. Maybe in more states than was the case, because it does look like, at the moment at least, that Harris has a bigger map than Biden ever had, that Biden had to basically run the same kind of inside straight that Trump ran in 2016, win narrowly every state you are competitive in order to win, whereas she seems to be back in play in places like Georgia and Nevada that he was well out of the game in.
Yeah. I mean, 3 weeks ago, we were talking about 3 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Yeah. Now, I'm not sure how many states we're talking about, but places like Georgia are part of the conversation again.
Okay. Grab your cheesies and rum and cokes. TELUS is making its way east with its pure fiber internet service heeding the call from the government for the urgent need for more sustainable competition in Ontario and Quebec. Leveraging the interim CRTC decision and following rigorous network testing, TELUS has already begun signing up subscribers for 24-month contracts in Ontario and Quebec. That's right, folks. TELUS is here to make sure you can stream, game, and watch as many cat videos as your heart desires. This isn't just about giving you internet options with the speed of light. It's about shaking things up and giving consumers more choices when it comes to selecting the internet services that work best for them. And we all know more competition means more options for you, the internet-loving public, and TELUS is all in on this mission. As you've heard before on this pod, this isn't TELUS's first rodeo in the internet arena of the East. Earlier this year, when snow was still covering the ground, TELUS's flanker brand Koodo first galloped into the market in Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba in 2023. This year, the Happy Stack offer gave residents a chance to bundle their phone and internet, because who doesn't want to save on bills? Now the TELUS brand is entering the ring, offering customers a chance to experience the blistering speeds that TELUS Pure Fiber delivers. You know, folks, the sheer size of TELUS and its unbeaten track record of giving back to the communities it serves. That's a business I want competing in my neck of the woods. So keep your eyes peeled, Herle Burly-ites. You may already be seeing info about this new fiber offering around town or in your inboxes. And with the CRTC's final decision looming soon, know that TELUS is already out there, providing more sustainable competition and choice to the fine people of the East. It is amazing how this has released evidence of how much resistance there was to the Biden candidacy out there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, resistance is one word. I'm not sure it's the best word. It was a kind of deflation around it. You know, one of the things I've been thinking about in the last few days is what is the meaning of enthusiasm? You know, those people who show up at a Kamala Harris rally are going to be largely people that would have voted for her anyway, largely people that might have voted for Joe Biden anyway. So what are they going to do? Vote harder? Dent the ballot box? No, what they're going to do is they're going to have an answer to their friends and neighbors about why they've chosen the candidate they've chosen. They're not going to have an embarrassing silence about trying to explain what it is about 80-plus-year-old Joe Biden, who sometimes can't finish a sentence and who stares into the middle distance as though he's departed the room. They don't have to make up excuses for him anymore. Not only do they have someone who doesn't do that, they have someone they're absolutely, genuinely excited about. There have been some reporting, largely by Tim Alberta with The Atlantic.
So why is that, by the way? Just stop for a second.
Sorry.
Because nobody was excited about Kamala Harris a month ago.
I think there are two reasons to it. The first is they did not think that it was possible to change the ticket. And when it became possible, suddenly, well, wait a second, that's good news.
Yeah.
But I think more important might be her own performance. I've never seen this Kamala Harris before. I've watched her closely, and I've actually been more critical than most about her political skills. Well, shut my mouth. I mean, she's extraordinary.
She's killing it at these rallies the last few days. Yeah.
And interestingly, I think some of the things that her opponents thought would work against her, and so they highlighted them. Her laugh, for instance. I mean, just completely flipped. People love what Walz called her joyfulness, right? Mm-hmm. They love that. It seems as though all of the drawbacks turned out to be assets in her case, right? Yeah. I mean, one of the things I noticed, and I think it was effective even if people didn't register it consciously, was when Walz was speaking on Monday, I guess it was, and she was standing behind him. The look on her face was one of complete confidence that I have made the right decision and I am proud of it, right? That is infectious. That's infectious. I'm going a little overboard myself about it, but I find that this is one of the most exciting things I've ever seen in politics.
Why were you critical of her? I mean, I know this guy, A. Smith, out of California, that's been her campaign person for years and years, ever since she's run for anything. And he's always told me she is a top-tier political talent. Like she's...
Really, yeah?
Yeah. He always knew that she had this in her. And when I was telling people that I thought she was underrated, I was doing it on the basis of, isn't every vice president underrated? I mean, nobody thought Nixon was worth a shit when he was Eisenhower's vice president. Nobody thought that Johnson was worth a shit when he was Kennedy's vice president. Nobody thought George Bush was worth anything when he was Reagan's vice president. It's not a job one can impress in.
Well, yeah, I mean, Dick Cheney, people did think he was the actual president, right?
Well, that's a different story, yeah.
They used to say that George W. Bush was one heartbeat away from the presidency. Cheney was the real president, not a weak heart. But look, back to your question. I mean, there were a lot of circumstances where I found her answers to fairly straightforward questions incomprehensible. What are you saying? The 2020 campaign, Kamala Harris campaign, was one of the worst campaigns anyone had seen. She started as, I guess, in the odds-on favorite. She, 538.com, for instance, listed her number one in the possible candidates for the Democratic nomination. And when her campaign imploded, there was an extraordinary piece in the New York Times quoting all kinds of people with her campaign on the record, saying she didn't know what she was doing. They had no sense of what she was about. She had changed her mind on significant issues for reasons that weren't apparent to them. And then she had just dropped out of the race before there was even a primary. So none of that induces much confidence.
She had no message in 2020.
She had no message.
No message.
She not only had no message, she had no strategy to win the nomination. You'll remember she made the important decision not to campaign in Iowa and then changed her mind as Iowa got closer. Her first decision looks to have been the right one because it's the same decision Joe Biden made. Yeah. But it just associated her with serious questions about her competence and commitment. And those seemed like reasonable reservations to me. When I was living in California and her political career was not a national exhibit, there were a lot of complaints about her on issues of crime and so on. And I saw that, and I also saw how easily some politicians in California can rise to national attention without having to fight very hard for it because of the way California is. And that has always led me to be cautious and discount a little bit the fervor around some politicians.
Right.
And so here I am to say that based on what I'm seeing now, boy, was I wrong about that.
Well, she has a message. That's one big difference.
Mm-hmm.
She has a message. We'll get into what that message is in a little bit, but I'm interested in what you know about the, because I have a little experience in removing people from office, and I'm kind of curious.
You want to get into that?
Not that. I want to get into what you know ultimately went down with getting Biden out of there. It seems like, from what I can tell, it seems like Pelosi was the determining factor, both in terms of organizing the movement and in terms of delivering the hard messages to her. Why her? To him? Yeah. Why her?
So I was having this conversation last night, and people were talking about just the circumstances that led up to them. The debate that got everybody's attention and caused great concern. The attempted assassination of the former president Donald Trump, and how people calculated that would only enhance his prospects. But nobody mentioned Pelosi. And I think Pelosi was the key to it. Pelosi is an extraordinary politician. She is also of his generation. They have had to work closely together than most presidents and speakers because of how narrow the margins were in both houses of the legislature. And she has demonstrated extraordinary competence and political acumen that has only enhanced her reputation as someone you have to pay attention to. And she has done it by also preserving her reputation as a kind of a truth teller and a straight shooter. And I think that when you lose Nancy Pelosi, it's kind of like losing, like Lyndon Johnson lost Walter Cronkite in the Vietnam War and knew it was over. And not only did she have that message, but she was very, very close to being public about it. When she said on MSNBC that she'll support whatever decision Joe Biden makes, and Joe Biden's already made his decision and said so, she is signaling to everyone
that she doesn't support the decision Joe Biden has made.
Exactly. I mean, there's a limit to how far she can go. She cannot say what you just said. But boy, you don't get much closer to saying that than like, think it over again, Joe. Have a second thought.
Yeah.
And
all these people coming out publicly, I gather that was all her organizing that and orchestrating that.
Well, I think that the meeting that Biden had with Chuck Schumer on the Friday before, not the Friday before the weekend, a week Friday before the weekend that Biden made his decision was also crucial. I think Schumer said, I think it's well known now that you've got a week, and if at the end of that week nothing has changed, it's not going to be the same circumstances. People are going to come out and say you've got to go. Think it over carefully, Joe, because it's not getting better. You should go. And then a couple of other things happen, like Pelosi and so on.
Yeah.
But I think all of these things come to bear on someone who is a reasonable person, which I think Joe Biden is. All politicians have ambition. You want to question that, but all the politicians have ambitions. This was a difficult decision for him, but he's not like Donald Trump is not someone you can reason with.
See, you're already going down the wrong road, Keith. You're already going down the wrong road, because if Harris wins, people are going to remember Joe Biden for this gracious act of nation building in which he set aside his own personal interests in favor of the party and the country's interest and stepped aside so that Harris could run and beat Trump. Yeah. He was dragged fucking kicking and screaming out of that place. Like he would be running today if he had his druthers.
Yeah, but when I say he's a reasonable person, he can read a poll. I mean, they had to persuade him.
They weren't even showing him polls. I saw a thing that said that they hadn't looked at a swing state number in 2 months.
They know what motivates themselves. They were telling him he's not going to win, right? Whether he looks at the poll with his own eyes or he listens to people who have looked at it really carefully is really kind of irrelevant. But I don't disagree. I don't think he was forced out by anything but the circumstances, and these people explained the circumstances to him. And my comparison, saying he was a reasonable person, was meant to be a comparison to the other candidate who should leave the race. No one even has a conversation about whether Donald Trump should be in the race, even though there's tons of evidence of how much damage he's doing to their prospects for the White House and down ballot, right? Nobody has that conversation with him because he's not a reasonable person. Right?
And there's no party left on that side.
There's no party left on that side. All the reasonable people left.
It's almost cliche to say so, but if there was any doubt left about our changing climate, well, Jasper. We all watched in disbelief last month as wildfire burned through a national treasure. Just to be clear, the Jasper wildfire remains out of control, threatening other nearby communities. And the Jasper fire is just one of hundreds burning beyond control at the moment. So far this year, over 3,700 fires have erupted on 2.2 million hectares, mostly in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the far north. That's above the seasonal average, and we're only halfway through the season. Smoke from Canadian fires has once again spread across the continent. Our sponsor, CN, has been on the front lines in Jasper. It has offered evacuation assistance, provided residents with fuel to allow life to continue, and has put two of its heavyweight firefighting trains, Trident and Neptune, to work. Trident and Neptune can go anywhere there's a track. They each arrived with 49,000 gallons of water, foam, and fire retardants deployed through pumps and water cannon. In Jasper, CN firefighters worked closely with provincial and federal authorities, and the railway only began a gradual resumption of train service once it was clear it could be done safely. But the situation is fluid. CN stands ready to respond to an increase in fire activity again at any time. The fact is, CN lives along its network. Hundreds of CN railroaders and their families were directly hit by the Jasper fire. This spring, CN pledged $10 million over 10 years for disaster relief across North America through a partnership with the volunteer force at Team Rubicon. Some of that money will be put to good use in Jasper and other affected areas out west. I've become a conspiracy theorist about this. Because
good for you.
I've become a conspiracy theorist and I'm enjoying it because, everybody I know was puzzling about how it is possible that Biden's people wanted a debate in June and then let him go out onto that stage even 5 minutes before, didn't pull the plug on that thing. And it is so inexplicable. You can't find any rationale for any of those decisions unless you conclude that they didn't think he should be the candidate, that they had been trying to convince him of that he wouldn't listen, and that they put these series of events in motion to get him out. Like I'm talking Jen O'Malley Dillon didn't believe he should be the candidate and didn't see any other way to get him out than having this set of circumstances play out and have a debate early enough that this process could unfold.
So do you think there was a battle about whether to do that? Because I would assume if that were the case,
that Donlan would disagree, right?
I'm sorry?
That Mike Donlan would disagree, probably, right?
Yeah, and then Jill.
Yeah.
But
Joe's a fighter. Let me out there. Let me at him.
Some of them, if not all of them, around him, close to him, had seen what happened with the State of the Union address. And if we assume that there might have been the same risk then, they were encouraged that he couldn't get through it.
Prompter.
But it may just be, you're not entirely right, but you're not entirely wrong, that it was kind of a cautionary measure, right? Fail safe. Let's do it now to be sure. And if we're not sure, which is how it turned out, right? I mean, it's not inconceivable that he could have given a State of the Union type performance and still be the nominee. But everybody benefited from testing it in June and not September.
Right.
Both sides of that argument. But my feeling about conspiracy theories,
if there hadn't been
generally,
a debate, he would still be the candidate.
Yes. But my feeling about conspiracy theories generally is that sooner or later, and often sooner, they're revealed.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the lessons of we've had a recent experience with a conspiracy, which was the conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election.
Yeah.
And what happened in the aftermath of that is that people were close to it and to some extent involved in it just blew the lid off it.
Yeah.
They became the witnesses. I don't want to go too far down the conspiracy theory discussion as much as I enjoy it. But I think that true conspiracy theories don't remain theories for very long. They become facts.
Okay. So what's going on with Trump? There's been a lot of focus on what unacceptable candidate Biden was. We've been talking about it, but you just alluded to this. Let's talk about how bad a candidate Trump is. He was barely beating Biden, and behind Harris, despite a massive advantage on the major issues. Like if you ask people how they're feeling about the economy now compared to how they were feeling about it when Trump was the prime minister, they say it's way worse. If you ask them about the border, they say it's way worse, right? So the Republicans should be winning this election reasonably handily, should they not?
Yeah, I think that they have, whether it's a truthful story, I think they have a good story. And part of it is on the economy. People like us might pay attention to the direction of inflation and the drama with which it fell as well as it rose. Most people pay attention to the price of stuff they're buying.
Correct.
And inflation may be going down, but the prices are not, and they will not. Right. So I think that's a very effective message for Trump. You're paying more for stuff now than you were when I was president by a lot. True story, right? And to the extent that the other side tries to argue based on a set of statistical facts and the opinions of economists and so on, they kind of sound like they're trying to gaslight you. And the political environment in which we all live now, gaslighting is a very familiar term to people, and it leads to distrust of official sources and so on. And Trump became aware of that and is a master of it a lot longer ago than many politicians. And so that's some of what we're dealing with.
Right.
But politics has become so tribal that people they cling to an idea of what they believe is true before they cling to the truth, right? And that idea of Trump as a Superman, only enhanced by his survival and assassination attempt, is a deeply held feeling among his supporters.
And all facts are absorbed through a partisan lens down there. So if you look at how Republicans feel about the economy, it's a 50-50 split in the country between Republicans and Democrats. And if you ask them how they feel about the economy, you get completely different answers. That can't be an accurate reflection of their financial circumstances. That's got to be their partisanship.
And I think it's been proved that you can fool them too by just mixing up the numbers and giving them Obama's economy and comparing it to Bush's economy, because this goes back that far, right? There was an Obama economy in the view of Democrats, which was very good, and there was an Obama economy that was a Republican view that was just a disaster, and that continues and continues and continues. It's a terrible thing to have to fight through if you're a politician in a campaign, isn't it? I mean, you can't have a functioning democracy if you don't have an agreed upon set of facts about the surrounding reality.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. But Trump is, I think we're all a little overly scared of Trump electorally, in the sense that he is a shitty candidate. You could argue in 2016, that he was an interesting candidate. He was far more agile mentally than he is now. He was funny. I don't see that much of that anymore out of him. But most importantly, he was talking about things that really mattered to Americans. He was talking about deindustrialization, and he had a villain, China. I'm going to fix that for you. He was talking about illegal immigration, and there was a villain, Mexico, and he was going to fix that. That's good campaigning. But today, he's just a somewhat addled guy wandering around talking about his enemies and the conspiracies against him. It's not at all making the most of his circumstance now.
Yeah. What I say about 2016 Trump is that 2016 Trump understood something that most of people in the political business are only really just coming to grips with, which is that the biggest economic story of the last 40 years was the export of high-paying manufacturing jobs to low-wage countries.
Right.
And he knew that.
John Turner and Ross Perot, stand up and take a bow, please.
I mean, I'm not sure. Yeah, Ross Perot was right. I think that was kind of a heavy lift for John Turner at the time, and of course, when Liberals won government in 1993, one of their first acts was to sign NAFTA and to go along with what was seen as, I think they call it the Washington Consensus or something. Trade
but Ross Perot said there's going to be a giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Right.
That's exactly right. So 2024, Donald Trump doesn't really have that issue in the way that he had it before. But the odd thing is, he may have some of it, but we don't know because he's not the guy who campaigns on that anymore. So much of his campaign is about grievance and just flat out whining about his own circumstances. The guy generally has real things to fear about the future if he's not president in terms of what's going to happen in front of judges and juries. But his mind, that preoccupation seems to have overtaken any sense of how to actually win the election by reaching out to people with a message that they're more interested in. I'm not sure any of them is particularly interested in rehashing the 2020 election or going through all the fine points of every legal difficulty that Donald Trump has.
No. So if he wins, he will win despite himself. In this case, not because of himself. I mean, if they'd chosen Nikki Haley, for example, this election would probably be over.
Yeah, but the thing about all of it is, it remains that even in 2016, Trump would not have won in most people's electoral system. It is the peculiarities of the U.S. electoral system, an electoral college whose roots date back to how do we figure out how to have representation in the legislature and deal with slavery at the same time, right? Like that's where all of that comes from. And they're still burdened by that system, and they need to figure that out, because how many elections in a row do you think they can go with one party always winning the popular vote, but maybe or maybe not winning the White House, right? Is that a sustainable thing in the long term?
Well, I don't know that it's any more or less sustainable than literally turning over control of the government to the East and West Coasts.
That depends on, I guess, how you define what the interests of the East and West Coasts are against the rest of the country, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, they
do have more common interests than they're prepared to admit.
Maybe, but there's an elite versus regular folk narrative in the States and reality in the States, and the coasts are different mentally. And so if you had a one person, one vote thing, then, Kentucky would never matter again.
But if you didn't have to, or rather, if you did have to campaign across the whole country, and say you're the Republican Party,
right,
that means you need to find new voters. How would you do that? Yeah. Probably by moderating your message and expanding your issue set.
They used to win California regularly.
And there are still more Republicans in California than there are in any other state in the union. Right? Like, this is reality too.
Is there anything that Harris can do to minimize the vulnerability on the economy or the border? Or does she just have to overcome that?
I think she has to, like most issues, she has to understand it. I think she has to appear to genuinely understand it in the way that people understand it themselves. We both know the limits on government leaders to actually determine the economic conditions of the country. There are other things that determine that much more forcefully. We've just seen how an earth-shaking event like a pandemic can upset the global economy in a profound and lasting way, right? And it's only simple-minded people like Donald Trump who believe that the president can solve that on day one, right? I hope people have gotten to that, and I hope that their expectations of political leadership are becoming more reasonable as they get off the kind of Trump mentality that all complex problems have simplest solutions that only you and I know about. Now, they just got to get over that. So if it sounds like I'm dodging your question, I think I am, because it's a difficult question. How does she do this?
I don't think they do sound on the border like the ordinary person sees it, because
on the border.
On the border, it feels to me like they sound more interested in the rights of people trying to get in, or people who have gotten in, than the average American is interested in the rights of those people.
Perhaps. They like to believe they have a good story to tell about the border, in the sense that, they were prepared to go along with a legislative solution that even Republicans felt was the strongest that they had, was the strongest that you could expect to pass in a bipartisan legislature. I don't know if it's that good a story. I don't know if you asked anybody if they knew what was in that bill, they'd have any idea. Right.
I don't think any of that works. It's what you said earlier. It's the outcome. It's the reality.
Yeah.
Which is illegal immigrants do destroy the lower working class economy.
And for such a long time, really smart people would argue against that, right? And there were, it's true that there were these kind of think tanky people who could fashion an argument that immigrants don't lower the, but it just doesn't sound sensible to ordinary people, that if you offer employers lower wage employees, why wouldn't they take them? Don't know.
They do. So let's talk about one interesting thing that interests me. The Democrats are using the word freedom a lot since Harris has become the nominee.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to redefine that word in terms of what it means and what it applies to, from the way the Republicans do. And they're trying to take that word back from the Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
What's the importance of that in America?
Well, I think it's part of a very old debate. What do you mean by freedom? Do you mean the freedom to do something, like own a gun? Or do you mean the freedom from something, like gun violence? And many issues can be broken down that way. But I think you could argue the Democrats have not been as effective as Republicans in having that word seen the way, in the context and in the way that they want it to, right? And so they have to reclaim it, as you say. But I think they've been handed some really good issues on that. For instance, on reproductive rights and abortion.
Right.
They should make that a freedom issue, because politically it just makes such terrific sense. That's what the people out there are feeling, right? Those who are mourning the loss of what they felt was their constitutional right to control their own bodies are feeling a loss of freedom. They don't have to imagine what she's talking about. They feel it. So I just think it makes political sense, but it also makes, it also is a familiar debate, right? That people do view freedom differently.
And what's the importance of that word in America?
It's at the very heart of it. They fought for it. So it evokes an image of themselves that almost all of them agree is righteous and true, ambitious and aspirational, but worth shedding blood for. Okay. Right? So that is their story. That is the American story is about a struggle for freedom. So it has all of those connotations. It is what America is about, they like to believe. Now, obviously, great arguments against that for a country that endured slavery for as long as it did. And I say that only so that people don't think I don't realize that.
Right.
But no, it's an extremely important word in America's self-image.
Well, I'm from Canada, and I don't know America very well. But I think affordability is the whole fucking ball game in North America right now. And if this election comes down to the Democrats talking about abortion and democracy and the Republicans talking about the border and the economy, I'm going to be nervous.
Mm. Mm.
Hey, what's Project 20? Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, why wouldn't you talk about abortion? Or are you saying they have to talk about abortion and also the price of eggs?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. So no, it can't be one or the other.
Yeah.
It has to be both.
Yeah. I mean, it can't be a question of how much money is it going to cost me to vote Democratic. Right. Anyway, what's Project 2025?
And so you ask now. I think we all had a better sense of what it really was a month ago, but now the Republicans are running away from it as fast as they can. It's essentially a blueprint for 2025 in a Trump presidency.
Right.
And it has strong streaks of Christian nationalism. And it has I think the most interesting thing about it has prescriptions for what it would like to do in the country that have to do with a very conservative idea of what the core of America should be, and returning to religious values and returning to community values that sound very much like a 1950s America, where on race, everyone accepted that there was racial equality in the country, and so they didn't have to do anything about it because everything was fine. It's that kind of a blueprint. But more important than those things, it's also a blueprint for how you implement these things, how you fashion a public service that's first loyalty is to these ideas and to this president, and the mechanisms by which you do that. It has an element of training to it. How do you train people to sell these messages? It's an extremely political document. It also is a policy document, but it's extremely political, and it kind of identifies, without being absolutely specific, that the Democrats are the enemy of America. That is kind of the founding spirit of the project. 2025.
Sure.
Now, I saw last night someone who was very closely associated with it. We thought Stephen Miller, who was part of the Trump administration, running away from that as far as he possibly could, saying it had nothing to do with him. It wasn't about the future of Trump, the future of another Trump administration. And then, of course, they have pictures of him posing with the book. Right? I don't know whether you saw this, but it was quite something, but
that doesn't mean he endorses or has read anything in there. And I have no trouble believing that he doesn't give a shit about what's in there, because he doesn't give a shit about anybody's opinion but his own. But that doesn't mean it couldn't be influential, depending
Absolutely.
on who gets appointed to all these kinds of positions, right?
Yeah. What I think of it is a kind of very, very large scale plan, constructed along the lines of the smaller scale but profoundly important plan to get to a Supreme Court that had a conservative majority that would overrule Roe v. Wade. And we know we know where that came from. It came from the kinds of places that the Project 2025 came from. Those kinds of thinkers, sometimes the same people. It was a long-term, well thought out, patient plan to transform the court. This is the same thing, but it's not transforming just the court. It aims to transform America into something that resembles very closely a Christian nationalist state.
Yeah, and the court's a disgrace.
What's happened with the courts? I mean, it's hard to feel optimistic about any of that. I don't know what the solution to that is, but the corruption aside, the corruption is astonishing. The actual literal corruption of some of the justices.
Just think how much better things would be if Joe Biden had just believed Anita Hill.
You know what? I don't know. What if Joe Biden had believed Robert Bork instead? Maybe even that would have been better. I don't know how you get to. Well, that's sort of how they got to Anthony Kennedy. I don't know how much we can blame Joe Biden for for all of this. Like,
well,
you know
he
who's
shepherded
weird?
Thomas in. He did shepherd Thomas
He
onto the
did,
court.
but you know who's weird? Clarence Thomas.
Yes.
Do you know? I mean, we listen to the things he said and questions that he asks in court now. Nobody reminds us that I think for something like a decade, he never said a word in court. He never said a word. He made it a point of principle to never ask a question, never make a comment, and speak only through his judgments and concurrences and dissents. That's it. I mean, like, that's weird, isn't it?
It is weird. It's also weird to be completely on the take while you're doing that.
Yeah.
So listen, I want to wrap this up with a big question for you. We were talking about it yesterday. This is a hope versus fear campaign. Fewer than 20% of Americans think the country's headed in the right direction. Most people think the economy is bad and life is unaffordable. Why would hope beat fear in this environment?
So, as you know, reading my morning paper this morning, I discovered something that I thought was interesting, and I shared it with you in a Charles Blow column about how African-American men respond differently to messages of hope than other people do. Other people, we can assume for the purposes of this question, are motivated more by their fears than by their optimism, their joyousness, their positive emotions. African American apparently are different from that. They are the opposite of that. It's important because those people are young African Americans and they represent a part of the constituency that is vital to the success of the Harris campaign and the Democratic Party across the country. I worry, as you do, that fear too often trumps hope or joy in this case. But I'm encouraged to believe that not always, and not in this circumstance, because Trump is not just a person who spreads fear. There's a darkness to him that's different from the darkness that we knew in 2016. That has nothing, that is in some ways joined with his fear of immigrants and of a world always trying to take advantage of the United States. But there's a darkness to him that has been revealed in things like the court cases that he's had to face. He is now a convicted felon. He is now someone who's been found liable for sexual assault. He constantly defames the justice system. His darkness is the strongest feature of his personality. Yeah. And darkness is not just about fear. It's deeper, uglier, and it's a clear part of him that people have to face up to.
Right.
I'm just making this up. I'm spitballing.
Yeah, but it sounds to me like it's really got to be a leadership thing. Like if people are going to reject that darkness and they have to see in Harris. Now, Democrats do, and more Americans than used to do after 1 week, but she's got to sustain that through another 90 days. They have to see embodied in her because she's not going to have anything to say about affordability that's going to give people hope. She's not going to, so they're going to have to feel it from her. It's going to have to be a leadership choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason why there's so much enthusiasm for her running mate.
Right.
As well. I'm not sure if I thought this or heard it. So someone was likening.
There's no bibliographies here.
Someone was sort of likening his political talent in a way to FDR. And the way they were doing that was saying, no, I don't know him. I don't know Governor Walz, but he knows me. And if he has that magic,
yeah,
we can argue about how much difference a running mate makes, but he might make a difference.
I think mind your own damn business is the best response to the social conservatives I've ever heard.
Yeah. He comes up with weird is his thing.
Yeah.
He thanked her for her joyfulness. He comes up with these things. kind of magically. But if he has that ability to make people feel that they know him and they trust him, that's a lot.
Assuming he matters. I've always assumed VPs don't matter. I mean, you can win with Dan Quayle.
Oh, yeah, I think most of the time that they don't. And it may turn out that this time they don't. But the extent to which we're looking for somebody who can carry that message of empathy, whether that becomes effective or not, I think is separate from the question of whether he genuinely has it.
Right.
He genuinely has it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but most of the time, I agree. I think Pence mattered to Trump. I think Johnson mattered to Kennedy. I think Cheney maybe mattered to Bush. But I don't think Gore mattered that much to Clinton.
No. LBJ mattered because he delivered a state. And for that reason, and that was the consideration in choosing him. You couldn't have thought of anybody JFK would rather have spent 8 years hanging around with than LBJ. But he needed Texas, so he chose him. That's the reason I thought she was going to choose Shapiro.
Yeah. And who knows how it's going to turn out. Maybe she should have. But then you really have to believe that Shapiro would have made a difference in Pennsylvania. And I think there's a strong argument that it could have. Yes. Yeah. Because he is so popular.
He's the most popular politician in Pennsylvania.
Yeah. I didn't notice that until a few months ago when there was just talk of Biden leaving. And I saw a focus group. And the focus group was being prompted about people like Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer. But the focus group itself came up with Josh Shapiro. And there was more support for him than anybody else, and they weren't prompted.
Right.
Interesting, I thought.
Yeah. Newsom's too California.
Yeah.
He screams California. Yeah.
Yeah, in the worst ways, too.
Yeah. Keith, thank you for this. What a great conversation. What a great kickoff to our coverage of the American election. I'm so looking forward to what you have to say.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to doing this again and writing for your air quotes.
Terrific. So, thank you, TELUS, our presenting sponsor. Thank you, CN Rail, for sponsoring this. Thank all you Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened to the show. And come back next week we'll have more. And periodically we'll have Keith, and we'll let you know. Take care. Keith, thanks for doing this. You're aces.
Herle Burly, 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 Herle Burly.